Hello, and welcome to Good News Rhode Island, the show about Rhode Island and all the people and places and events that make Rhode Island a great place to live, that build our communities. One of the people who's done that, who's moved here, 3 years ago from Arizona, is here now. Bishop Nicholas Knisely is here with us, the Episcopal Bishop of the Diocese of Rhode Island. And he's here to talk about lots of things, mainly issues of faith and science, but also issues of the cathedral and guns and violence. So we've got a lot to cover in a short time. But welcome, Bishop.
Thanks. I'm glad to be back.
Thank you. Let's just review for a moment. You were a physicist and taught physics for a long time, but were somehow converted or changed your mind and became a theologian and a priest?
I think probably the most accurate way to say was, as I was finishing up my research and my doctoral work in physics, it became clear to me my vocation was not to be a physicist, which I had known all along. I was frankly hiding in physics from God. I had a sense of God calling me to ministry when I was a teenager, and I was scandalized by this behavior I saw of people in churches. So of my teenage mind, it made sense to hide in a place where God could not find me, and that seemed like the laboratory.
Wow, that raises a lot of questions.
There's a wonderful story. I don't know if we have time for it, but if you have an hour or so, I'd be glad to tell you the whole sorry tale.
Well, but it sounds like a lot of people's journey. You know, people see something that's negative about the church or that's negative about life itself, and they begin to doubt God and their relationship to God.
Yeah, for me, it was a matter of becoming mature and realizing that people could be misbehaving in one part of their lives and yet still deeply faithful in another part of their lives. I think that's the moment when we arrive at adulthood, is when we begin to realize that other human beings are just as odd as we are and are not completely consistent in their personality or in the way they behave. Everyone's a little crazy, and it's really lovely.
You're also interested in the arts, I believe, too. Is that right?
I met my wife in math class, but in fact, we dated for 4 years dancing together. We danced with Barbara Barden in her dance troupe in Lancaster, and I've done some theater, and I do a lot of singing. I haven't had a chance to do any of that here in the state, but I'm looking forward to finding time for a hobby again someday.
That would be nice, I'm sure. I'm sure you work many hours. Well, getting back to faith issues, a lot of people feel that if they have doubt, that there's something wrong with them, that there's something that maybe they haven't believed the creeds properly or whatever. I tend to think that doubt is a sign of strength.
Well, you know, we talk about within Christianity, we're saved by a sense of faith, faith in God. What does that faith mean? Well, it really means hope. The opposite of faith isn't doubt. The opposite of faith is certainty. I wish that was something I came up with, but I'm quoting someone else and I'm not remembering who was it. I think it might be Vernon Dozier. But the opposite of faith is certainty. If you know something for sure, you have no need of faith. So if you find yourself doubting the creeds or struggling with them, well, that's completely contained within the world of faith. And I think it's important for us who are religious leaders who have studied at great length what the standard understandings of the faith statements are, to remember that they're standard understandings and there's a constellation, a cloud of things that live within the area of understanding. St. Augustine once said the creed functions as a fence, and inside that fence somewhere is the truth, and outside that fence is probably not the truth. But the fence is a pretty broad area that it defines, and there's a lot of space to move around in there. It's one of the things I like best about our tradition, the Episcopal Church, is I really try and emphasize this to the people. We manage to pray together. We don't even begin to expect that we understand the words in the same way.
And the words are all ancient. A lot of the words come from other philosophical traditions, and we're trying to interpret them with today's understandings.
We're going to recontextualize them in this modern experience and understand that the people who follow after us will recontextualize them in their understanding. And so each generation, each moment in time in society has to put its own sort of intellectual work into making sense of the creeds for them.
So if I say, I know Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, that may mean something different to someone else. Sure. Or as our understanding grows of creation, we will understand Creator differently, or first being differently.
Yeah, I mean, there's always some tweaks that we have to make to it. But Father, Son, and Holy Spirit are the way that the Godhead identified itself to human beings historically. Father meaning the fount of being in creation, Son being the second person of the Trinity, the hinge between humanity and our divinity, and the Spirit being some force that motivates and enlivens our lives. And the really sort of scandalous part intellectually is that they are all persons, three persons of one being. And anyone who tells you they understand it doesn't understand it.
Because it's really Greek philosophy in a way. It's Greek theology.
It is something beyond our ken as human beings. I think we as finite creatures are trying to understand an infinite, uncreated being. And everything we say is going to be conditional. Everything we say is going to be only a partial understanding. And we use Greek understandings, we use Hebrew understandings, we use Jewish background, we apply modern Enlightenment ideas to it. But everything is going to be temporary and partial.
People talk about being spiritual. They're not religious, but they're spiritual.
I have a friend who says he's religious and not spiritual. I'm very happy to be that way.
Okay.
I'm not quite sure what either of those categories mean.
Well, people mean that they are interested in being quiet and meditating. People mean that they're searching, maybe in a nonverbal way, for something, and I think that they're responding to the Holy Spirit. But I'm wondering if you would talk a little bit about meditation and prayer and how that kind of changes people's viewpoint of life.
Yeah,
maybe I'm putting words into your mouth.
Well, I'm trying to think what words I want to have come out of my mouth. I think the question of meditation, which is part of a tradition of prayer that is very common within Christianity as well as within Eastern traditions and seems to be built into us as human beings in some way, is that moment where we sit quietly and be very aware of what's going on around us. Centering prayer is usually the language we use within Christianity to describe that kind of meditative prayer. What it does for us, I think, is it takes us out of the hurried experience of life that is so much our Western experience of life and places us in a moment where we begin to understand the timelessness of who God is. It's one of the key theological points that religion makes about our spiritual experience, is that God exists outside of time. And we are creatures who are created to live in eternity, but we are in this moment in the flow of time. And so we have this sense of being sojourners, we have this sense of being pilgrims. The Native American people use the phrase kainosclatsi, which is sort of time out of sequence, time out of joint. And being able to meditate, being able to be still and know that I am God, as God says in the Hebrew Scriptures, is a way for us to sort of keep that separation and space. One of the things I think is really helpful is to understand that over 2,000 years of Christian history, over all the spiritual yearnings of humankind and all the other religious expressions, there are lots of experiences of how we do that meditation, how we are meditating and it's drawing us to God, because there are ways to meditate and it doesn't actually take us to where we want to go. We find ourselves swimming against the tide of God's love in our lives. And we talk in Christianity of spiritual direction. A lovely phrase from Celtic spirituality is the idea of a spiritual friend. And I think everyone needs to have a spiritual friend to have a chance to talk through what they're feeling in their own spiritual yearnings and in their lives. And whether that happens within the context of a community of faith, a congregation, or it happens within an online community, or it happens with someone just having a deep personal friendship to a person who's worked hard at their spiritual life. It's really important that you have something like that in your life. And that's where I don't know that you can make the distinction between I'm spiritual but not religious. I'm spiritual, but I need to be part of a religious movement so I can test out what I'm experiencing.
And hear what other people are saying.
And have that external reference. Human beings are extraordinarily gifted at self-delusion.
One of the things that we're learning in our generations is the immensity of space, and the possibilities of other planets and the possibilities of other beings. And I wonder how you feel. I think that affects our prayer and affects our understanding of ourselves in a huge way. We don't even know how that is yet. But maybe as a physicist you could talk about that.
It's a huge question, and we don't know the answer to it yet. There's two ways this could come down. The universe is very big, and nature seems to, at least on Earth, like to make life. Now, the question is life therefore happening on other parts of the universe, in other planets, in other galaxies, in other solar system structures within our galaxy? The principle of minimum astonishment as a scientist would tell me, yes, it is. The hard part, of course, is we have to define what we mean by life, and that's not an easy thing. I have a good friend of mine, Lucas Mix, who's in a religious order that I'm part of, the Society of Ordained Scientists. And Lucas is at MIT right now on a Templeton Fellowship. He's moving to Princeton in the Institute for Advanced Studies for the fall. And he's working on trying to apply theological understandings to a definition of life. So if we come across a virus structure, a genetic virus structure on Ganymede, one of the moons of Jupiter, we're going to have to ask ourselves, does that constitute life? I think when we're talking about life in theological terms, most people are fascinated and focused on the question of, is there life in the universe that we can have a relationship with? Is there life in the universe that we can have a conversation with? And boy, that would change our understanding of who we are in the universe. There'll be questions theologically about how that other life relates to God. Do they have a spirituality? Do they have a sense? Do they have a need of God? Do they have a need of a Savior that we Christians find in Jesus? Did they fall in the theological sense, or did they not? Deep questions. And they may be deep questions that have no answer, because there was just a recent study published. They've done a quick survey of 100,000 galaxies, and at least as we are looking now, we're seeing no other signs of life anywhere in the universe that we can see, that we could have a conversation with.
We have a Eucharistic prayer that says, "This fragile earth, our island home," and I think of the Ark of Noah,
Right.
and the fact that we are floating in the middle of this huge, huge space, which we can't even imagine. We don't have the bird to send out.
Right.
Basically, it's us. But what does that say about the church and its and the synagogue about our care of this planet that we have?
Well,
I mean, it seems to me it's going to be redirecting how we look at ourselves as Christians.
I think that's absolutely right. Scientifically, I would say there's the Fermi paradox. one of the basic things in science is to say that you and I are not special. If there was another culture in the universe somewhere, we human beings would want to contact them and visit with them, have a conversation with them. If we are not special, then we would expect that there are other intelligent races in the universe that could talk to us. They'd want to talk to us and want to visit us. Fermi, the great physicist in the 20th century, was the one who pointed out, well, then where are they? If they aren't there, then maybe they don't exist. If they don't exist, and that's a very strong argument, by the way. People have really worked hard at that question. If they don't exist, then we're it. In the vastness of the universe, this little planet, this third rock from the sun, to borrow a phrase from a sitcom, this third rock from the sun is the only place where life exists and where life has become self-aware. And life has the ability to perceive that it is embedded in this extraordinary universe. How fragile, how valuable, how precious is all life if that's the case. And I think part of our role as people of faith, people who are engaging the scientific community, is to take that message out to people and say, look, don't squander this. Don't waste your time trying to fill your moments with useless things. Go out and look at a sunset. The miracle of being a set of atoms that have assembled themselves into a pattern that can perceive that we are rotating around a star as we revolve in an orbit is just the most extraordinary thing. Go look at this everyday miracle and be amazed.
But what if outreach were to save an earth that's being crucified or being punished or being harmed by our faith, by our way of being?
Outreach from the church?
Yes,
or?
I think the church, I personally believe that the church needs to move in that direction, to become ecologists, to become saviors of the world.
Well, I think we're all looking very much forward to Pope Francis's encyclical that will be coming out this summer on the questions of climate change and the theological response to the way that we as human beings are harming the world. I know that within the Anglican communion, the part of the church that I'm from, we will be very excited to work closely with the Roman Catholic communion and any other person of faith on this creation care, because it's a huge issue. There's so much we can learn about God by looking at the incredible creation that God has placed us in. I think that's one of the things that I, as a scientist, find so compelling about science, is that in understanding some little tiny corner of creation, I begin to understand something new about God that maybe I didn't understand as a person of faith. One of the things I like about being a person of faith is I begin to understand something new about God that I didn't understand as a person of science. And it's that conversation that's so critical. I think the church and science together have to have that conversation, because we have a responsibility to care for this miraculous creation in which we find ourselves placed.
Thank you. I want to change gears, and it's really a change, and that is to talk about the cathedral. There is a cathedral on North Main Street. It was built in It
was founded in 1722.
Oh.
It's the oldest cathedral in the Episcopal Church in the United States. The present building is a federal building, and that comes from the 1820s, I believe. But it appears it's one of the most important early examples of Gothic architecture in the American Episcopal Church and anywhere in America.
It seems unique to me, but anyway, you have now been searching for 3 years to find a use for that building across the street from Roger Williams Park, Roger Williams Federal Park. Tell us a little bit about it. I would say maybe 5 minutes worth, and then I need to talk about another issue as well.
So what happened was, when I came to the diocese, my predecessor had suspended the services there. The congregation had dispersed among other congregations in Providence and in Pawtucket, and even down into Cranston. I've met people from the cathedral congregation. I invited the larger diocese to have a conversation. If we're going to have a cathedral, we need to have a cathedral that has a very specific mission. And the mission that emerged from the grassroots conversation is a desire to work on the ministry of reconciliation. This idea of how do we learn to live together in tension, We don't agree with one another, but we manage to live together comfortably in spite of that disagreement. How can we disagree without being disagreeable, as a friend of mine said at a meeting last night? Part of the work I think we have to do in reconciliation, and it's something that grows out of our unique experience in Rhode Island, is dealing with our participation in the slave trade. Rhode Island was one of the leading slave-owning states in the country, was the leading slave-owning state in the North into the 1820s. 90% of all ships that sailed and carried slaves from Africa were sailing under Rhode Island flags. And much of the rum that is part of the triangle trade was coming out of Rhode Island. Sure, there were some families that were particularly involved, but this was much broader than just those families. Everybody who was involved in economic enterprise in New England at that time was involved somehow in that trade. One of the things we want to do is work with the Tracing of the Trade Foundation, work with people who've done reconciliation work and say, how can we tell our story as people who participated in the slave trade, who supported it in some ways and in other ways really opposed it? And that you see that in Rhode Island history, you see that within the Episcopal Church and within Christian communities across New England. There are voices that supported it and voices who were raised in opposition. How do we tell that story in a way that we can be reconciled to our past, we can be reconciled to the communities that historically we have harmed, so that together we can begin to demonstrate what it would look like to live together as a reconciled community? What we are hoping to do with the cathedral is create a Center for Reconciliation. Part of the work of the Center for Reconciliation would be to tell the story of the slave trade and the church's involvement in the slave trade. But we also will keep it, I dream, as the cathedral of the Diocese of Rhode Island. So there will be a worshiping community of some form, not a traditional worshiping community most likely, but there'll be a worshiping community of some form eventually as we begin to reconstruct and restore the building so that it can be used again. And we're looking for other ways that we can work with the community, ways that we can work with the Park Service. We're right across the street from Roger Williams National Park. Ways that we can work with historic African American organizations here in Rhode Island, because obviously they have a key voice in telling this story, and we need to let them have a chance to speak to us, because we've been telling them for a very long time what they ought to think, and we need to hear from them what we ought to hear now.
Sounds like a very, very important task, but also huge.
It is a huge task. I can't tell you how gratified I am by the support we've gotten, not just here in the state, but we've gotten nationally. Mm-hmm. The story about this project appeared on the front page of the Los Angeles Times and the Los Angeles editorial page right after Ferguson. This is this question of reconciliation, how do we live together in tension and yet still be a community, is being demonstrated as we see the unrest in the cities, as we're having these conversations about the appropriate use of violence in arrests, all of these conversations that are happening across the country.
And it seems to me that art in that space will be very important, because it will be a point of reconciliation.
Right, and that's one of the things we're hoping to be able to do upstairs. Music, drama, dance, art, all of that will be part of how we tell our story.
Amazing. Well, that's very exciting. Now, the other thing is the other story of Ferguson, and that is violence in communities. Mm-hmm. I think you're very active in the gun control. Well, I don't even know what it's called now, but why don't you talk about it?
So, out of the shootings in Newtown, I think the response to the church across the nation was that we have to become involved in this, that we have to find a way to put a stop to the epidemic of gun violence in our country. Second Amendment of the Constitution says Americans have a legal right to bear and store firearms. That's our Constitution. That's not up for question. But the Supreme Court's also said that the government has the right to regulate how those firearms are managed and who can have them, how they can have them, and how we want to allow ourselves as a society to have that conversation is what I'm interested in. So Bishops Against Gun Violence was formed. There's Clergy Against Gun Violence. There are People United Against Gun Violence. All these different organizations. There's Rhode Island Coalition Against Gun Violence here in the state. They're all sort of asking us to have a very intentional conversation about accessibility of guns and violence. Now, here in Rhode Island, we really are very blessed. There is gun violence in the state, but I think the police departments, the law enforcement people across the state have done an extraordinary job of keeping us safe. We've had conversations, those of us who are involved in this community, have had conversations with the police departments. They're asking them what kinds of things are common sense, small fixes that we could do that would make us even safer. And there are some places where there are parts of the Rhode Island state code that aren't in agreement with federal code, and the police chiefs have said, we really need to fix that mismatch. We've talked to those people in the state legislature. I know there are a couple of bills going through the state house this year. I don't know if they'll pass or not, but we've tried to invite people into a conversation about that. Some of them are trying to keep guns off school property. There's a loophole in the concealed carry regulations. Some of it is a matter of whether or not people who are convicted of domestic violence felonies, can they have access to gun permits going forward. Both the things that in federal gun statutes, I think it is that they're not allowed. Within Rhode Island state statutes, they are. We'd like to make that consistent. And I think part of what we do is learn how to work together as a community across the state to have that conversation. How do we decide what we want to allow in Rhode Island? And how do we make sure this is a conversation that we're having in Rhode Island, not a conversation that's being funded by people from outside the state? And I think that's the really key part. The beauty, I think, of being a Rhode Islander, and I'll be a Rhode Islander for the rest of my life because I'm here till the end, is how do we be a people who live in such a wonderful, densely populated, precious jewel as this city-state that we all co-inhabit with one another.
And hopefully the non-gun owners and the gun owners will eventually be able to be reconciled as well. Somehow there has to be some middle ground.
Right. How do we live in the tension of having people who have disagreeing understandings, but still have to live and make community with one another? That's where I find the church has a place and a voice.
The future of the church, we have 2 minutes. But I imagine that the future of the church will be very different from what it is now. I don't know how it will be different, but I think the language will be different. I think maybe we'll use telecommunications more than we do. I think we will probably have different uses of our buildings than we have now. What are your thoughts?
Well, in the minute I have left,
yes.
I agree
it's not
with you.
fair.
The short version is every 500 years or so, humanity has a giant intellectual rummage sale, and we come up with a new way of understanding ourselves and our relationships. I think we're moving out of an Enlightenment understanding, out of a scientific reductionist understanding, into more of a networked understanding. As that happens intellectually, it's going to affect how the church. You should have me back, and
okay.
I'll tell you about that sometime.
I would love to talk about that. Anyway, thank you, Nicholas Knisely, for being here, the Bishop of Rhode Island, the Episcopal Bishop of Rhode Island. We certainly wish you well with all your undertaking, and thank you for watching Good News Rhode Island. We hope that there's good news in your neighborhood, and certainly that you're helping to make it. Thank you for watching. We always have